Each year, the richest Americans legally avoid paying billions in taxes. Not because they cheat, but because the system was written around them. In 2022, the top 1% held over $44 trillion in wealth. Yet many of them paid a lower tax rate than a teacher or a nurse. At the same time, the bottom half of the country, over 165 million people, control just 2.5% of the nation's wealth. And yet, that bottom half pays more in payroll taxes, consumption taxes, and mandatory fees than some billionaires do in federal income tax. So how is it possible that the people with the least give up the most, while those with everything give up almost nothing? It's not a glitch, it's not new, and it's not even hidden. It's a system you were never supposed to understand, because understanding it would threaten the very thing it's designed to protect, the appearance of fairness, something Machiavelli warned would become the most effective tool of control. We're told the tax system is simple. The more you earn, the more you pay. But that only applies if your income is earned in the way most people are familiar with, through labor. If you work for a paycheck, you get taxed immediately. There's no negotiation. The rules are fixed, and they apply to everyone who sells their time to make a living. But that's not how wealth works. Wealth isn't taxed like wages. It doesn't show up on a paycheck. It doesn't flow in neatly on the 1st or the 15th. It sits, it grows, and it doesn't owe the system anything until it chooses to move. The wealthy don't earn in the traditional sense. They own assets, equity, appreciating positions, and that gives them access to financial tools that don't just minimize taxes. They delay them, restructure them, erase them entirely. They don't need loopholes, they use the map. They borrow against their wealth instead of selling it. They reclassify income through entities and trusts. They defer gains and carry losses forward across decades. These aren't tricks. They're standard procedures. And unless you've studied tax law or inherited a fortune, you were never taught any of it. But it's not just about knowing the rules. It's about two completely different games being played out in real life. You're playing checkers. They're playing chess. You're moving forward one square at a time, trying not to get wiped out. Meanwhile, they're thinking 10 moves ahead, sacrificing positions strategically, controlling the board with rules you didn't even know existed. Carried interest, deferred gains, foundation structures, step up in basis, accelerated depreciation, trust ladders. To most people, those terms sound like another language. That's by design. Because the system doesn't need to hide. It only needs to sound complicated. When things get complex, people assume someone else must understand it. They stop asking questions. They assume it's fair because they're told it's legal. But legality and fairness are not the same thing. A law can be technically correct and structurally exploitative at the same time. John Rawls, an American political and ethical philosopher, once posed a thought experiment. If you had to design a society without knowing where you'd end up in it, rich or poor, powerful or powerless, how would you write the rules? You'd likely want a structure that protects the vulnerable and distributes opportunity. But our current system was not designed behind a veil of ignorance. It was designed by people who already knew exactly where they stood and had every intention of staying there. That's how you get a tax code that favors capital over labor. That's how you end up with billionaires paying a lower effective tax rate than nurses and firefighters. Not because the billionaires broke the law, but because the law was built with them in mind. And yet, most people don't protest. They internalize it, they rationalize it, they repeat what they've been told, that the rich are just smarter, more disciplined, more deserving. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that societies justify their own hierarchies by moralizing them, by assigning virtue to control and weakness to those at the bottom. When inequality grows large enough, people don't just tolerate it, they sanctify it. And that's what makes the structure nearly impossible to challenge. Because the moment you question it, you risk sounding bitter, uninformed, conspiratorial. It's safer to believe it's fair, or at least too complicated to be unfair. Meanwhile, the machine keeps running, quietly, efficiently, elegantly. The more wealth you have, the easier it becomes to preserve it. not just because of tax law, but because of access to legal teams, accounting firms, offshore shelters, and legislative influence. A middle-class family might debate whether to use TurboTax or hire a CPA. A billionaire can spend millions designing a custom entity that turns income into capital, and capital into silence. And all of this happens under the full light of day. Because when something is legal, it doesn't trigger resistance, it triggers resignation. Noam Chomsky observed that modern power doesn't rely on censorship, it relies on distraction. The public doesn't need to be silenced, it just needs to be overwhelmed. While everyone's arguing over gas prices or student loan forgiveness, tax policy quietly evolves behind closed doors, negotiated by lobbyists whose job is to protect the very architecture we're told not to worry about. That's how wealth creates influence, and how influence writes the rules. Aristotle once described two kinds of justice: distributive, where benefits and burdens are shared fairly, and corrective, where imbalances are addressed. But our tax system does neither. It doesn't distribute opportunity. It preserves position. And it doesn't correct inequality. It reinforces it. Most people think of taxes as something the government imposes. But in reality, tax policy is something that evolves. Through negotiation, campaign financing, lobbying, and closed-door legislative edits that often get added minutes before a vote. And that brings us to the question most people never ask. Who actually writes the rules? It's not lawmakers, not really. Congress might sign the bills, but the language inside those bills often originates elsewhere, written by tax lawyers working on behalf of trade associations, corporate lobbies, and financial interests, whose job is to influence outcomes before most citizens even know what's at stake. Every clause, exception, and footnote is a battlefield, and on that battlefield, most people don't even know a war is being fought. The public gets to see the final vote, the press conference, the press release, but the scaffolding beneath the law, the very definitions that determine who pays and who avoids, that's often negotiated behind closed doors, buried in subcommittee markups, or attached as last-minute amendments to unrelated bills. The code is built with surgical precision, and those with access shape it like clay. When the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham described the idea of the panopticon, a prison where control is maintained through the illusion of constant surveillance, he wasn't just talking about architecture. He was illustrating how systems can enforce behavior not through force, but through perception. In the world of taxation, that illusion is complexity. Because when the rules are unreadable, when compliance feels intimidating, when every form feels like a trap, the average person obeys instinctively. They pay automatically. They underclaim deductions. They over-report income, not out of honesty, but fear. Meanwhile, those with wealth don't fear the system. They fund it. They donate to campaigns. They endow policy think tanks. They place former CFOs into government advisory roles. When regulatory frameworks are debated, it's their consultants drafting models, their economists presenting the projections. By the time a tax law reaches the public eye, it's already been vetted for impact, not on you, but on them. And so, the cycle continues. Every few years, a new tax reform bill is passed. It promises to close loopholes and raise revenue. But somehow, the loopholes remain, and the revenue shortfalls are covered by cuts elsewhere: education, healthcare, infrastructure, the very things that affect those who can't afford to write the next law. This isn't a conspiracy, it's just incentive, working exactly as designed. Adam Smith, often cited as the father of capitalism, warned that whenever people of the same trade gather, the conversation quickly turns toward a conspiracy against the public. He wasn't condemning free markets. He was warning that, without transparency, markets become machines for consolidating power, not distributing opportunity. And that's exactly what modern tax infrastructure enables. It's not just a means of funding government. It's a tool for preserving dominance. The wealthiest individuals don't just use the tax code, they weaponize it. They convert stock options into deferred income. They park assets in family offices and offshore entities that are technically legal, structurally opaque, and virtually unreachable. They donate appreciated assets instead of cash, avoiding capital gains while scoring deductions. They use grantor-retained annuity trusts to transfer massive wealth to heirs, tax-free. None of this is accidental. None of it is illegal. It's the system, functioning as intended. But here's the part that rarely gets mentioned. This infrastructure doesn't just protect wealth, it manufactures the illusion of merit. Because once a structure is legal, it becomes defensible. It becomes a symbol of ingenuity rather than exploitation. The wealthy aren't seen as beneficiaries of structural privilege. They're seen as brilliant, strategic, deserving. Hannah Arendt, in her exploration of power and obedience, wrote that the most dangerous form of domination is the one that appears rational. When exploitation is dressed in the language of policy, when inequality is justified as efficiency, resistance becomes self-sabotage. You don't just accept the system, you defend it. And so, while the majority fights over crumbs, minimum wage debates, inflation shocks, tuition fees, the architecture of wealth preservation continues unchallenged. Not because people support it, but because they don't understand it. Or worse, they believe they might someday benefit from it. This is what economists call the lottery ticket effect. The belief that everyone has a shot at wealth and therefore should protect the rules that favor it. But statistically, the climb is steeper than ever. Upward mobility has stagnated. In many Western nations, a child's financial future is now more closely tied to their zip code than their effort. Still, the illusion persists that one day you'll be on the winning side. And when you are, you'll want the system to still be there, intact, untouched, and tilted in your favor. But here's what never gets said. The system was never built to reward the climb. It was built to trap people on the wrong side of it, by confusing them, exhausting them, and convincing them to stop looking up. The IRS knows this. In fact, the agency audits low-income taxpayers at rates similar to the wealthiest, not because they yield more revenue, but because they're easier to audit. Simpler returns, fewer lawyers, fewer obstacles. The logic is cold. Go where enforcement is efficient, not where injustice is greatest. And so, year after year, the rules stay just complex enough to be unapproachable and just legal enough to be unassailable. By the time a young adult earns their first paycheck, the system has already begun shaping their understanding of fairness. Work equals tax. Labor equals sacrifice. Any attempt to challenge that dynamic, to ask why ownership isn't taxed the same, is dismissed as radical. But pause here for a moment. If the richest benefit from laws written in their favor, and if the middle class carries the load without understanding the code, and if the poor pay with every dollar while being told the system is fair, then what exactly are we calling justice? Nietzsche warned that when society sanctifies suffering, when it turns struggle into moral virtue, people stop questioning why the suffering exists at all. They start believing they deserve it. That if they're broke, it must be a character flaw. If they can't escape debt, it's because they're irresponsible. Meanwhile, the machinery of wealth keeps churning, faceless, blameless, and uninterrupted. And this is where it becomes existential. Because if the game is tilted, if the rules are rigged, if fairness is performance, then what does it mean to participate? That question is quietly reshaping the choices of an entire generation. Some disengage, refusing to vote, refusing to file, refusing to play. Others dive headfirst into financial self-education, convinced they can master the rules. A few retreat into crypto, alternative assets, or relocation, chasing sovereignty in a world that no longer rewards it. But most are just tired, numb to the complexity, focused on surviving the next bill cycle. And that exhaustion, that quiet fatigue, is what keeps the structure standing. Not belief, not trust, just inertia. So where does that leave us? The truth is, tax law isn't just about money. It's about narrative. The story a society tells about who owes what, to whom, and why. And right now, that story's broken. We're told the rich deserve to keep more because they contribute more. But we rarely ask, contribute to what? We're told the middle class is the backbone of the economy. But we don't ask why the spine carries the most weight and sees the least relief. We're told the poor need skin in the game, but we don't ask how much more skin they can afford to lose. Philosophy doesn't offer easy answers here, but it does offer the right questions. Rawls asked us to imagine fairness from behind a veil of ignorance. Bentham warned of control through perception. Arendt dissected how compliance becomes self-sustaining. And Machiavelli, he understood the deepest truth of all. Power doesn't need to be just. It only needs to appear stable. And as long as the system looks complicated enough to justify itself, it will remain intact. Until someone asks not just how the rules work, but who they're really working for.